Hi, welcome back. We're looking at genetics and we're going to have a little look at where all these ideas came from. Who started off having these ideas that there were characteristics that we could inherit, and more importantly, that there was a pattern to the way in which we inherited these characteristics. Well, the first person to actually do proper scientific experimentation breeding plants was this Czechoslovakian monk who from the age of 21 lived and studied in Austria. His name was Gregor Mendel. And Gregor Mendel worked in the monastery gardens, particularly growing pea plants. And he was interested in that sometimes pea plants had very wrinkled seed coats. Sometimes they were long and straight. Sometimes the little individual peas, the seeds, were yellow and sometimes they were green. He also looked at the color and the shape of the flowers. And he started noticing that there were patterns of inheritance. And he started doing hundreds and hundreds of experiments where he would collect the seeds from plants that he saw had certain characteristics, and he would plant those seeds, wait until they developed, grew, and from the flowers he would collect pollen and he would pollinate other plants. And he started noticing that there were patterns or trends that came out in the way in which characteristic features were inherited. And he made these deductions. He said that a hereditary characteristic in an individual, for example, the height of a plant, is determined by factors. So it wasn't just something that possibly happened. He pinpointed it down to being a factor inside the plant. And he used the word factors, and only much later, in fact even after his death, were these factors named genes. He made another deduction and he said a factor will come in two different forms. For example, the height of the plant could be tall or it could be dwarf. And these different forms of the factor were of course later called alleles. He also deduced that one factor came from the one parent and the other factor came from the other plant. And that was his very important deduction that led us to understand that these inherited characteristics came from the parent. One from the parent plant, one from the other parent plant, or in the terms of animals, one from the father and one from the mother. He also made the deduction that one factor will always dominate over the other factor if both factors are present in the individual. So, for example, he said that if we had tall plant crossed with a dwarf plant, all of the offspring from that crossing would be tall. And so he deduced that the one factor, the one form of the factor, tallness, dominated over the other factor, or the recessive factor, for shortness or dwarfness. He also proved that you could get back to having a dwarf plant. Let's go back to that slide which shows us that in our parental generation, if we had a pure breeding tall plant and a pure breeding dwarf plant, the first filial generation, let's spell that for you, filial, meaning the first offspring generation, would all be tall. So clearly, tallness is dominating over shortness. But if you took those offspring plants, this was the first filial generation, and you made them into now a parental generation, you crossed them with each other, what you would find in the second filial generation would be that 75% of them are in fact tall, and 25%, or 1/4, show that dwarf characteristic. And this puzzled him. He couldn't understand how suddenly what was happening is you had a tall characteristic or tall factor dominating over the dwarf factor or the recessive factor, but you could still keep it in the plant, you could breed it through generations, and suddenly, after breeding it through 2 generations, you got a dwarf plant. And so he did more reasoning, he did many, many more experiments, and he ended up coming to 3 very important conclusions that in fact have become laws in the science of genetics. Now, what we mean by a law is that they are factually based and they will always behave in a certain way. The principle of dominance is that when you have a tall plant or a dominant feature, dominant allele over a dwarf plant or the recessive allele, all of the offspring in the first generation will all be tall. His second law was the law of segregation, which said that the alleles are separating into different gametes. He said that, for example, you will have gametes that are formed that either are tall or short. You'll never have both gametes or both characteristics in one gamete. And his third law was the law of independent assortment, which said that tallness doesn't always go with pink flowers, doesn't always go with yellow seeds. All of these characteristics mix up and assort themselves in a very independent way. After the break, we're going to look at some of these crosses and you're going to work out some genetics problems for yourself.